Welcome. My name is Niklas Hagelberg. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for UNEP's Climate Change Program, and it's a pleasure for me to invite the people in this room and the participant online to this event on the findings of the 2023 Emission Gap Report and how it connects and guides the global stocktake that countries are negotiating here in Dubai. UNEP's Emission Gap Report is in its 14th edition, and it has built up a decisive role in the negotiation in taking stock of the collective ambition towards the Paris Agreement temperature goals. The Emission Gap Report has found a place in many of the interventions that countries, heads of state and negotiators are taking in the negotiation rooms, and we have heard it featured multiple times over the 2 days in the World Climate Action Summit here in Dubai. I would like to take this opportunity to also point out that the Emission Gap Report is a major collaborative effort where about 80 scientists put in their data, their insight into building this report. It would not come together with just buying the brilliance. It has to be in the heart as well. And big thank you to all of those authors for contributing to this report. And it indeed is a regular stocktake of where we are in implementing the Paris Agreement. I will do a quick introduction of our speakers, and then one by one they will come up to the podium and present their part of the findings of the report. So first, in the middle, I would like to introduce Anne Olhoff, who is the Chief Scientific Editor and also the conductor of the entire Emission Gap Report team, and Anne also works with CONCITO. Here next to me we have Joeri Rogelj, who is a lead author and also a director of research at the Grantham Institute and also a professor of climate science and policy at the Center for Environmental Policy at the Imperial College of London. Greg Muttit, next to Anne, is also a lead author and a senior associate at the IISD. Jakob Mulugeta, furthest to my left, is again a lead author and a professor of energy and development policy at the University College of London. Oliver Gedden, to the right of Anne, is also a lead author and a senior fellow and head of research cluster for climate policy and politics at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And with that, I would like to hand over for Anne. We have about, in total, 45 minutes. We'll see if we get to taking questions from the audience. Otherwise, if there's no questions, I got a few twisty ones for the authors.
Thanks very much, Niklas. And it's great to be here. It's always nice when we get to this stage of actually presenting the findings, and it's always super nice when we have so many lead authors to help out on the presentations. So as Niklas mentioned, this is the 14th Emissions Gap Report, and each year we release them just ahead of the COPs to inform the discussions here. And in terms of the process and the setup of the report, it's an assessment report. So it's an annual independent science-based report building on all the major new studies and modeling undergoing. We've had 79 authors involved this year from 47 different institutions across 22 countries. And as you can see here, here's the whole series of the report coming out every year before the COP. So what's special this year? Of course, it's the first global stocktake, and we really wanted to focus on some messaging and findings that could feed into the discussions here in Dubai. And here you can see all the main questions asked in the report. We always look into the key trends in global emissions. We look at the progress in ambition and also in action since last year and this year also since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And then, of course, we look at the implications both for the emissions gap in 2030, which is basically the difference between where we will be in terms of global emissions if countries implement their current pledges for 2030 on mitigation, and where science tells us we need to be to have a likely, that's at least 66% chance of reaching or achieving the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement of keeping temperatures well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. We look at the global warming implications, and then this year we dive into two areas that are increasingly important, and one is energy transitions, both globally, but also this year we have a special focus on low and middle income countries because trends are changing also in terms of emissions, and by now low and middle income countries account for 69% of global emissions. But transitions in these countries obviously have to take place alongside development and other goals being fulfilled. And then finally, we have a chapter on carbon dioxide removal, which is basically necessary in all the scenarios to keep global temperature to below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. Good. So I'll just get us started with some of the key findings from the first two chapters of the report, and then I'll hand over to Joeri for chapter 4 on the emissions gap. So if we look at global emissions, they actually increased by 1.2% from 2021 to 2022. And we also see that by now all sectors apart from transport have fully recovered from the drop in emissions induced by the COVID-19 pandemic and now exceed the previous record high of 2019. At the same time, we also see that emissions of methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases increase, and these have a larger or much more heavy global warming potentials than other greenhouse gases. If we then look at progress since the last COP, since COP27, there's really not been that much progress in terms of countries strengthening their pledges for 2030. We've seen that only 9 countries have responded to the call to strengthen their 2030 pledges since last year, and if fully implemented, these pledges are only estimated to reduce global emissions in 2030 by 0.1 gigaton of CO2 equivalents annually. However, if we look at progress since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, there are better news. We have seen that countries have put forward strengthened pledges for 2030, and collectively, and if fully implemented, these actually lower global emissions by about 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents relative to the initial NDCs. And then we also see that there's been an evolution in the NDCs themselves, so that more now contain greenhouse gas emissions targets. There's greater coverage both of sectors and gases, and more also include unconditional elements, that is, that countries promise to do something without getting anything fulfilled. If we look at progress of the G20 members toward their NDC achievement, overall there's no major change from last year. The ones that are on track are primarily the ones that haven't really put forward much strengthened pledges, or that were already on track to achieving their pledges of 2030 based on policies already in place. But we do see promising sign, and that is that the implementation gap, which we define as the difference between where countries are heading in terms of current policies and where their NDC targets are, is diminishing. It's becoming smaller. We've seen that it's now quite a lot smaller than last year. So now globally we have an implementation gap of around 1.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in 2030 with respect to the unconditional NDCs, and 5 gigatons with respect to the conditional ones. And I'm actually going to hand over to Joeri now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, for setting us up so nicely. Now coming to the graph that the report is named after, the emissions gap, looking at, again, where emissions are heading if we implement all the pledges that countries have put forward, or all the policies that they're actually implementing, and the levels of emissions that we actually need to be in line with 1.5 or 2 degrees. In the report, we also have a 1.8 level, which is not shown here, just for clarity. And we can see that The emission gap is still very large. We have not seen a large, or we haven't seen any movement in ambition of pledges since the last report. So the ambition gap, so the difference between the pledges and the 1.5 and 2 degree ranges, remains the same. It's of a size of more than 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions in 2030 for 2 degrees and around 20 gigatons of CO2 for CO2 equivalent for the 1.5 degrees. The only good news here, as Anne already mentioned, is that the discrepancy between what current policies are delivering and the NDCs has been reduced over the past year. If we then look beyond 2030, this is the first time that the emissions gap report actually has looked at time periods beyond 2030. And that is really to inform where we should be heading with the next round of NDCs. We can see that if we continue forward what is pledged and the policies for 2030, we end up with a gap of around 18 gigatons CO2 equivalents for 2 degrees and 29 gigatons CO2 equivalents for the 1.5 degree goals. That really highlights that what we do for 2030 and what we fail to do for 2030 has ramifications for what comes afterwards. We can pull that even further and look at 2050, and there you can see that this gap, of course, becomes even more dramatic. What are the temperature implications of this? For current policies, we avoid around 3 degrees of warming. For the NDCs, 2.5 to 2.9. If we, in our most optimistic scenario, where we take into account what current countries have pledged, including the long-term net zero targets, we avoid 2 degrees. That is the most optimistic interpretation of what countries have put on the table, not the most optimistic of what can still happen. A last point I want to highlight is what the implications are of these temperature levels. We only, in the high-level messages, we only show one number, be it 3 degrees or 2.5 degrees. But of course, there is a large uncertainty around this. Under current policies, warming more than 4 degrees is far from excluded. The same so under the most optimistic case, we see roughly 1 in 6 chance that warming ends up below 1.5 degrees, but equally so, we see an important chance that warming still ends up above 2 degrees. And with that, I would like to hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Joeri. One of the great things about the emissions gap report each year is that having assessed the state of progress, as Joeri has very clearly outlined, the second part of the report turns to how do we close this gap? And the remaining 3 of us speakers are going to start to address that. And central to closing the gap has to be a transformation of the global energy system. It has to be central because approaching 90% of global CO2 emissions come from the burning of coal, oil, and gas. Now, what this graphic here shows you is that on one level, the climate change problem is conceptually quite simple. It's a problem of too much fossil fuels. What this graph shows you is infrastructure that has already been built to extract oil, gas, and coal in the form of mines, drilling platforms, and so on in the left-hand column, or to consume fossil fuels in power stations, transportation systems, in buildings, and so on in the right-hand column. And what you see from the graph is that whether you're looking at extraction or consumption of fossil fuels, there's the infrastructure that already exists would exhaust the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees several times over if operated for its full economic life. A conclusion from that is that we need to see some of this infrastructure closed early before the end of its economic life. Now, that's a policy conversation that's only just beginning and only in relation to coal power plants. It's something policymakers are going to need to think about a lot more. And if new fields and mines continue to be opened, new fossil plants continue to be built, as they are at present, an even greater quantity is going to have to be closed early. Now, to take the place of these fossil fuels, of course, we're going to need to see a dramatic increase in generation by renewable energy, and we're also going to need to see a reduction in overall energy consumption worldwide. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean a reduction by everyone, or even by every country. There are still around 700 million people lacking access to electricity, and over 2 billion lacking access to clean cooking fuels. Rather, what it means is increasing energy use by some in order to meet people's basic decent living needs, while decreasing for others. In other words, greater equality in the use of energy. A final point I want to make is, as Anne said, two-thirds of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from low and middle income countries. Jakob is going to talk about how to tackle energy transition in low and middle income countries. But the point I really want to stress is that as all countries take action, equity becomes more important, not less important. And what that means is that high-income countries need to reduce emissions much faster than low and middle-income countries, much faster than they are currently, and need to dramatically scale up their support to enable the transitions in low and middle-income countries. With that, I'm going to hand to Jakob to fill in the details.
Thanks, Greg. And if I like this, is this better? Yeah. But first of all, I'd also like to thank Anne, who has been leading this initiative for, what is it now, 10 years, 12 years, a long time. And we all, look forward to the Emissions Gap Report and its publication, starting in July and so forth. But also being part of the Emissions Gap Report process itself. Anne leads it with huge sort of elegance and understanding in trying to keep us all in line. But another two people that I would like to also mention is, of course, Navros Dubash, who's not here today, but has been instrumental in getting this I believe, this chapter into the Emissions Gap Report, but also Narasimha Rao, who actually has taken the lion's share of the burden in producing this chapter. So thank you to both of them. Greg has touched on a number of issues that relate to this particular chapter, but the key one really is the question around development. And in many ways, you're talking about a group of countries that have very different economic and resource configurations. And one of the things that we did was begin to sort of map out those different countries. And they spread across, those who are exporting fossil fuels, those who are importing fossil fuels, others who are fully engaged in renewables, and others are merely sort of importers. And there are also a new set of countries that are looking at expanding their or opening up fossil fuel opportunities. Each of these is going to require very different ways in which that they are going to transition. And therefore, one of the things that we talked in this chapter is that the development context is very much, it has to be center and front and center of the transition challenge. Now, this also requires quite a lot of capacity. Without the sufficient capacity, there isn't a huge amount that you can do. And that's something that particularly the LDC countries are faced with in terms of building capacity that's able to think, able to generate knowledge, which is very much locally focused. Now, this also takes us into the whole question around politics, and one of the things that this chapter also encapsulates is institutions actually matter, and context, the political context, is also everything. And I think there is a real opportunity, a real buzz, if you will, as we await for the next round of NDCs, that there is a real opportunity to be able to develop nationally driven maps and investment-ready type of opportunities. A lot of the work that we do in CCG and other places, this is really very much directed to ensuring this. But the big elephant in the room really is finance. I mean, in the past, when we talked about energy, for example, we talked about energy, but every conversation on energy, on leads us to finance. And access to affordable finance is absolutely dire when it comes, to LMIC countries. And part of this is really the cost of capital is higher in the poorer countries. One of the things that we found out was that we're talking about 7 times more expensive to do anything in the poorer countries than the US or the EU. So this has to be somehow bridged. Now this requires both internal as well as external adjustments that would need to be done. And the quantity that we're talking is quite significant, orders of magnitude. But also the key area is also the issue of mature markets. For example, if you're talking about the EU transition, a lot of that depends on domestic or mature domestic markets. The challenge for particularly the poorer countries in the LMIC category is that they have to access that finance from international markets that tend to be very fidgety when it comes to resources, partly because they are putting in quite a lot of thinking in terms of the risk that each country represents. When you factor that in, then the cost of capital for the poorest countries is too expensive.
Yes, thank you very much. So last but not least, carbon dioxide removal, which can be sometimes a quite contentious topic, but I think it's now more and more accepted that it is needed at some scale, simply because we talk a lot about net zero emissions, and the net part already indicates that we will have some residual emissions left from hard-to-abate sectors that need to be covered by carbon dioxide removal. So you've often seen probably overview slides how which kind of, let's say, methods we have, how they can be clustered. I think to not get lost into it, it's important to actually ask ourselves how carbon is captured, where it is stored, and maybe most importantly, how long it is stored for. And the most durable options, storage in the lithosphere, in minerals, and in geological formations. So what's here in the middle, often where you combine a certain form of capture, for example, from bioenergy or direct air capture with CCS. And in the global scenarios that also are being evaluated in the UNEP Emissions Gap Report, it's usually BECCS, bioenergy, CCS, direct air capture with CCS, increasingly enhanced weathering, but traditionally the most of it comes from afforestation and reforestation, where you of course run into many issues and trade-offs with land use. And afforestation and reforestation, if you cluster that as one method, I think it's more than one, then of course this is the method we have experience with already. And in line with other reports, we cluster afforestation, reforestation as traditional or conventional CDR. The others are a novel CDR method. And there's often the assumption, okay, if we talk about CDR, then we shift the attention away from emissions reductions. But if you look at what the scenarios do, the scenarios the UNEP Emissions Gap Report assesses, then it's clear that until 2035, there's not much of a substitution of emissions reductions with carbon dioxide removal. And if you go to net zero CO2 being at the point where warming or additional warming should end, then you see that in 1.5 scenarios, but also in 2-degree scenarios, 80% and more come from reducing emissions. And then with different shares between conventional or land-based CDR and novel CDR. So over time, the novel methods, bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture with CCS, will take a much larger share. That's also because of limits to land use, but also to limits to the effectiveness of forestry-based methods under a warming climate. So the achievement of this gigaton level over time is uncertain. It can be seen, rightly so, as a problem that we already assume it's going to be done. But regarding government plans, they are lacking. One thing that always needs to be taken into account is that we need robust measurement, reporting, and verification to do it in a credible way. And for some methods, that will not be particularly easy to do it like that. With the land-based methods, it's also not perfect how we do it. And it also reminds us that it's always easier and more efficient just not to emit, because then we don't have to track where the carbon is. We just know it had not been emitted. If you remove carbon dioxide, then you have to find ways to measure and to track what you already did and if it's still there. And specifically novel CDR, where you need new technologies, you can, if you compare it to other early stage phases of new technologies, for example, in renewable electricity, they will go through a formative phase and will need a lot of government support in that formative phase to become available at larger scales in, let's say, 20 years from now. And you could say, although we say that quite often now, it's a critical decade, but if we want to deliver on what is already in scenarios, this would be the critical decade for novel CDR methods. Thank you.
Okay, I have been attached to the wall by a wire, so let's see how this works out. All right, so I can't move from here. Okay, thank you all so much, and indeed this is a smooth running machine. We're on time with the presentations. The report came on time. We actually even could advance it. It was a little bit earlier already than we planned. So this is an amazing machine. We got about 20 minutes left, and I have a couple of questions, but I would like to see if the audience, any burning questions. Excellent. And now we have a little bit of then the question that how do we get all these wires out? And if you could kindly introduce yourself and tell from which organization you are at.
For sure. My name is Angela Carter. I'm at the Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador and also the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I work with those folks too. So I'm from Canada, and my question for you is about CCS or CCUS. I'd love your help in understanding this and communicating it, because I see it listed here as a solution with caveats. But in the Canadian context, CCS is drawing a lot of subsidies by the oil and gas sector that is using CCS primarily as an enhanced oil recovery method, but yet arguing that this is a climate solution. So I would love some of your feedback on how to navigate the complexity of that solution or not. Also thinking about the International Energy Agency with the recent report saying that this is an illusion solution for the oil and gas. Help me communicate about this, please.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Oliver, you probably know that that microphone is coming to you next. So we start with Oliver.
Not necessarily. Is it working? Yeah. Not necessarily, because CCS is in general not carbon dioxide removal. So there are two things to think about. Where does the CO2 come from? If it's fossil CO2, it cannot lead to carbon dioxide removal, but fossil fuel CO2 is carbon capture and storage can of course help to reduce your residual emissions. Then the question is it useful to do that? And for oil and gas, the scenarios show there's only little CCS on gas and coal. I mean, it does not make much sense to combine it with oil when burning oil. Then, of course, enhanced oil recovery is then the only business case that is right now there. What to do with that CO2? Governments could incentivize just storing it beyond enhanced oil recovery. Where it's basically discussed right now is for industrial installations where you don't have other options, like in cement plants, at least not in the medium to short term. For a long time, I think it's important to keep that in mind, it has been discussed as the primary options for steel plants until we then went into the hydrogen route. So it's not a given that in cement you definitely need it in 50 or 100 years. It depends on just the production process. But for the time being, I guess cement is the prime candidate for using CCS for process-based emissions because it's independent of the energy input. But as the IEA showed, trying to do that just to prolong the business as usual in coal and gas it does not make sense even from a macroeconomic point of view. But, and then now the last sentence on CDR, combining it with bioenergy, when the bioenergy feedstock is sustainable, and combining it with direct air capture could then generate negative emissions. So I would say it is not a CCS as such, that is a component of something bigger, and then the question is what are the other components in that chain?
Thank you. Do we have another question? That felt almost like an auction. Do we have another offer? Yes.
Hello, my name is Oliver. I'm from ActionAid Denmark. I was interested in the part about capital costs for low and middle income countries and being part of the transition. Are you seeing any examples about when it becomes possible for them to get the finance that they need? Like what is necessary? Is it that you need to bundle projects together in order to reduce the risk of the institutions giving the finance, or is there other ways where you're seeing what does it take to do that?
Jakob, I think that's coming to you.
Can I use that? Yeah. I think it's a good question. It's a question we can discuss, in great detail. I think there is certainly something that countries can do, and one of the things that we are talking about in terms of capacity is strengthening the national capacity in terms of being able to produce the knowledge, but also the kind of projects that could be funded. That's at the national level. Of course, fixing your regulations and so forth. But the other aspect of it is also persuading the investors. For example, there is a tendency to assume that there is a risk perception, particularly when it comes, countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There is that challenge of risk perception that increases the value or the cost of capital, and that's a very difficult one to be able, because it is a very subjective thing on something which is concrete, on something which is quite objective. So there is a discussion, I suspect, even leaders in the advanced economies are beginning to pick this up. Macron, for instance, he talks about that. The question is, what is there that we can do to try and change the landscape, the finance landscape that seems to be the biggest obstacle in my view.
I may add there, so you may remember that in September, Kenya organized an African climate summit in Nairobi, and one of the key findings was just 14% of climate investments in Africa come from private sector, whereas in US it's above 90%. So there's clearly an issue there, and we can't get up to the level of investments unless we figure that one out. And the message from that summit was very clear. Capital has to become cheaper, and I believe that I've heard, especially from the Nordic countries, that they want to invest their resources in lowering that capital and that perceived risk in terms of private sector investment in climate action. So perhaps there's the recognition of the issue has definitely gone up, and I would say some early progress there as well. Before I open up again for the floor, I would like to look at Joeri and Anne. You've been part of this report for quite a while, and you know the situation. It doesn't look too good. What are the recommendations? What kind of outcomes would you like to see from the Global Stocktake based on this expansive experience you have? What are the 2-3 things that you would like to see coming out at the end of the next 2 weeks?
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, indeed. So this was a 15th year? 14th, yes. 2010 was the first time we did this exercise. I think for the Global Stocktake, first and foremost, I would like the outcome to reflect the scientific facts and the scientific assessment of the situation we are in an accurate and honest way. That is just for the technical part of the global stocktake, but in itself, that's already a challenge. If you look at the various discussions, including in Substa and so on. A second one, of course, is that the political implications of that shortfall that is the logical outcome of the global stocktake, or of the assessment of the global stocktake, of what the political implications are for that. And thinking just about a small chapter that I'm part of every year at the global level, I think a really interesting signal, or a really good and powerful signal, would be to kind of define more clearly what Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, 4.1 of the Paris Agreement, already hints to, is that we need to reach a peak of global greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and decline thereafter. I think if the COP can actually translate that in naming the year in which we should be aiming for that peak, that would be great. Of course, that's really just a symbol, but the idea would be that that we get then the actions in the next coming years with the updated pledges and the new NDCs for 2025 to make that then also a reality, or closer to reality.
Excellent. Anne, anything to?
Yeah, no, I would like to see, and this is like my Christmas wish list of all times. So first of all, I would love to see a decision text that includes the mentioning of ideally phase out, but if not phase out, at least phase down of all fossil fuels, and no mentioning of unabated, if I had my way. That would be great. I would love to see more focus also on what happens from here until the next round of NDCs. How are we going to support an actual move towards much greater ambition, much greater implementation across the world? Of course, still, as you also pointed out, Greg, focusing on faster action in high-income and high-emitting countries, but also in getting all the rest of the world along the green transition way, and making it possible to really integrate and unite development and green transition goals. So that would be nice to see that coming up more directly, also providing the support that some countries may be needing to develop much more concrete and much more ambitious NDCs, where they could attach real investment plans and opportunities to these. So.
Excellent. Thank you. Greg?
Is this working?
Just a second, is it working?
I can use it. Okay, thanks. I just wanted to build slightly on what Anne said about phase out of all fossil fuels. The last two COPs, as you know, we've had a decision text that called for a phase down of unabated coal power. Thank you very much. The trouble with the sole, or one trouble with the sole focus on coal is that it can create a perverse narrative that countries of the global south are the ones that need to do the most to act on climate change. Coal is used disproportionately in developing countries, oil and gas more in developed countries. And so I think we've seen that narrative play out very much in the last two COPs, with a blaming of large emerging economies for resisting that sole focus on coal. So I'm really, like Anne, I'm really hopeful that the GST will call for a phase out of all fossil fuels. And I just want to add one other thing to that, which is I'd really like to see the GST call for the kind of scale up of finance that we need to see. As Jakob was saying, we need to be talking about an order of magnitude. And I think, as I look at it, the lack of provision of the serious kinds of finance on the scale that's required is perhaps the biggest barrier we are facing to action on climate change.
Thank you, Greg. I hope you all took note. You will be requested to go to your respective countries and talk to your representatives here and push for these messages in for the Global Stocktake. We got 5 minutes left, and I'm starting to raise my voice because they have ended their session on the other side. This is a question for Oliver, Greg, and Jakob. The title of the report is Broken Record. It feels like we're not moving ahead. In your work now on these chapters, did you find anything that gives you reason for optimism? Is there something there that you see that, hey, there is an underlying trend? And perhaps if we start with Oliver.
Well, my chapter is maybe an odd chapter to think about, because many think, okay, CDR is basically the talking point because we talk about a broken record, what we have not done in the past. We do not necessarily have to see it like that. If we say, yeah, net zero is an important goal, starting from a geophysical perspective, I would say policymakers have kind of forgotten that it would involve CDR. And that's why it's net zero and not just zero. And at least there you can say that some countries are seriously working this out now and start to make things happen on a national level, which is important because we cannot continue to assuming stuff to being done in 10 or 20 or 40 years, but nobody even starts with it. We would like to know, are they serious? Are governments serious? And what are the experience? And they can be very tricky in the detail in how to do biochar in Denmark and get it on the national accounts and get rewarded for this. So many tricky questions, technical questions that countries now start get into it. At the same time, it's worrying that CDR sometimes it's used as an excuse by just saying, yeah, we're going to deal, we basically do business as usual and going to deal with it via CDR. But I think if you force governments to have national plans, you can at least scrutinize what exactly are you doing here. Just assuming, we don't need to do that many emissions reductions, we will still have CDR, and not quantifying it, I think, is the bigger problem.
Okay, I didn't see too much optimism quite yet, but there's still...
They did not bring me in for that, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Greg, energy transition, is there something there?
I'll try and be a bit more optimistic. It's a low bar. I see a lot of, I see hope in the voluntary climate clubs that are establishing in relation to the energy transition. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the Clean Energy Transition Partnership, where governments that want to pursue greater ambition in energy transition are coming together and committing to do it, helping each other do it, and then just doing it. I'm very grateful to the country which is announcing today it's joining the Clean Energy Transition Partnership. I'm not sure if it's announced yet. So it has? Okay.
Oops.
Okay. Thank you very much, Norway. It's great to see you joining the Clean Energy Transition Partnership and committing to not providing international public finance for fossil fuels and diverting it to clean energy. It's great to have Norway on board there. We're seeing growth in the PPCA and in BOGA. This year, Colombia joined BOGA, a country of the global south with significant oil and gas production. And I think we're going to see growing momentum in these kinds of initiatives. And that's where I draw my optimism from.
Excellent, thank you. Jakob, you only, I'm afraid, have only 1 minute to what's in the low and middle income countries. Is there something there that...
I would say, a couple of things. One is there is a serious conversation around economic diversification happening at the moment. And countries are really serious and optimistic about their industrial policies that would take a greener kind of shape. Where that's going to lead us, it's for us to see, but it's also for us to support that effort. And these are countries that are very much, oil and fossil fuel based, who are having these discussions. The other one, which until recently was a bit a nebulous discussion, is the just transition debate, and often it had been framed around the North and the South. Of course, there is that inequality at a global level. But I think also the inequalities that have led us to energy access in some countries, being whatever, 80% non-access in a number of countries, is now entering into the policy sphere. And I think, this is something quite positive and quite, I'm optimistic about that, we will close the gap in a short period of time, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Jakob. That was, I feel we did end on a little bit of a positive note there. So first I would like to thank the team here, and there's a much bigger team also behind the group that you see in front of you here. But I would also like to thank the Nordic Cooperation Pavilion for hosting this event here today. And with that, we're on the minute of ending this show. So thank you so much for joining us today.